Woke up this morning with my mind gonna stay on freedom. Oh, woke up this morning with my mind gonna stay on freedom.
I am the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe. I'm the Executive Director of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. In 2019, filmmaker Ava DuVernay created, co-wrote, and directed a 4-part series for Netflix entitled When They See Us. Her series chronicled the story of the Central Park Five, 5 young Black and Latino men who were charged with the assault and the brutal rape of a white woman jogger in Central Park, New York. The case received international recognition. Then private citizen and businessman Donald J. Trump even took out a full-page ad in the New York Times demanding that the 5 young men be executed. However, more than a decade later, new evidence was revealed that they were innocent, that they had been falsely accused, and they went from being known as the Central Park Five to the Exonerated Five. But do we know the story of the young men in North Alabama, the so-called Scottsboro Boys of 1931? The story of 9 young men who were falsely accused of the assault and the rape of white women on a train moving through North Alabama. They were tried, they were convicted, and decades later, exonerated. There's a connection between what happened in 1931 and what happened in 1989 and perhaps what is still happening today. Join us as we go to North Alabama with one of the newest sites of the consortium, First Missionary Baptist Church of Decatur, which is where most of the story of the Scottsboro Boys unfolded. Join us for this special episode of Justice Delayed, the legacy of the Scottsboro Boys.
These are the names of the 9 Scottsboro boys: Roy Wright, Andy Wright, Ozzie Powell, Haywood Patterson, Clarence Norris, Willie Robinson, Charlie Weems, Eugene Williams, and Olin Montgomery.
The Scottsboro Boys case was ultimately a landmark civil rights case pertaining to a group of young African American men who were accused of sexual assault. A train was traveling through northeast Alabama, near the Paint Rock and Scottsboro communities there in northeast Alabama. And a young lady on board had previously had some run-ins with the law, and sensing the need to protect herself, she falsely accused her and a friend of hers, falsely accused after a commotion happened on the train. She falsely accused these young men of sexual assault. And what happens in the aftermath of this accusation and this disruption on the train was very much consistent with what was happening during that moment in time. A lynch mob circles the jail there in Scottsboro and threatens to lynch these young men who've not been credibly accused, who've not had all of the privileges enshrined in the founding documents of this country, like a jury of one's peers, due process, legal representation, mob justice, mob violence, and white supremacy that lorded over the legal system and the lives of those young men was an immediate and existential threat to them as the lynch mob gathered outside of the jail. The trial happens, the young men are convicted, and when the retrial happens, the retrial is situated in Decatur, Alabama. And that is the intersection between our church and our community in this story. In 1930s Alabama, Black people are not largely seen as equal citizens with equal protection under the Constitution and under the laws and under the language in the laws of this land. They are seen as kindling for the political and legal furnace. And the Scottsboro Boys are viewed that way. The Attorney General wants to try this case and mete out harsh, vicious justice to demonstrate that he's the kind of candidate that people with his worldview can feel comfortable voting for governor. Black people in 1930s are not viewed as citizens. They're viewed as a kind of pawn in a political or legal game to demonstrate a larger point.
So the sheriff had actually assigned 425 seats were there. So a section of 3 would be for whites, a section of 1.5 would be for blacks. Keep in mind, the courtroom was segregated. There was a line out in the hall. It was even segregated. But that was the times that we lived in during that time. They wanted to try them all together, but they said no. So they had 4 different trials. And 8 of the 9 received the death penalty to die in Alabama's Yellow Mama, which is the electric chair. The youngest boy, Roy Wright, because of his age, they decided that it would go to juvenile court, that he was too young to die in the electric chair. The Alabama Supreme Court upheld the decision that the Scottsboro judge had made, but they also found out there was another young boy who was too young to receive the death penalty, and his name was Eugene Williams. So their cases were referred back again to juvenile court. Keep in mind, while these appeals were going on, all of these young men were held in Kilby Prison. November 1932, the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, makes a ruling that their 14th Amendment rights have been violated, Sixth Amendment rights as well.
The great tragedy of the first trial, I think, is reflected in how much of the legal proceeding is effectively predetermined because of the color of the skin of the accused. Is to say that to be black and to be on trial in 1930s Alabama and in the South in 1930s is to be vying for or arguing for the presumption of your innocence against the presumption of your guilt. There is an overwhelming outcry from the public from the time these young men are arrested to hang them, to lynch them, to kill them. The sentiment of the people who will make up the jury of the peers in the first trial is the sentiment of the mob. And so we do not have a legal environment that will facilitate the opportunity or the possibility of a jury of one's peers, because the peers in the jury box do not see the accused as their peers. They view themselves as their social and moral and ethical and even religious and cultural betters.
Old Town is the very first community that was established in the city of Decatur in 1821. It is the oldest black community in Decatur. Old Town is unique. Old Town had blacks, white, Jews, Lebanese. You did not have to go out of Old Town for anything but upscale clothing store. We had our own doctors, dentists, we had our own midwives, we had our own plasters, electrical people. We had everything you need. The Scottsboro Boys case is important because not only of the tragedy of it, but the 2 landmark Supreme Court rulings that still exist today. The 2 Supreme Court rulings was Powell versus Alabama and Norris versus Alabama, stating that you had to have legal counsel and that you had to have a jury of your peers. This ruling gave blacks the legal right to sit on a jury, because as you know, no blacks were on the Scottsboro Boys trial. on the jury. No blacks was on the jury. Although we present 3 lists of doctors, lawyers, property owners, dentists, all of those was included on the list, but they didn't qualify. So this ruling gave blacks the legal right to sit on the jury.
It is here, it is in this church, before the trial, where people have their understanding of themselves as people who are made in the image of God and who have a sacred responsibility to push for a more just and more righteous world. That's shaped in the church. The defense attorney is defending the Scottsboro Boys. In one of the ways he is sort of crafting his defense, so to speak, is using the church as a meeting place to begin to share with the community his vision for how he wants to effectively petition the court and say, your position that there are no competent African American people to serve on juries is incorrect. And as evidence to the fact that your position is incorrect, I've got signatures, right? And many of the people who signed this petition are members of this church all over the South, all over the country in the 1930s. When Black people began to contest exclusion from the system, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which shares an architect with us, Wallace Rayfield, is bombed during the Civil Rights Movement because the church is such an important and catalytic part of that movement. This is not an imaginary danger, right? So there is a risk of losing one's life for Dr. Sturrs, for Dr. Darden, for Mr. Sykes, and all of the other members in our church who don't just sign the list, but who also come to the meetings. So when we start talking about the role of the church in the Scottsboro Boys case, okay, the church is the place where the defense's legal strategy is crafted. The church is the place that allows the community to meet and partner with the defense attorney to be a part of that legal strategy, okay? And the church is the place that creates that community that is resourced with the people that are able to be a part of that legal strategy.
They have their list now, they're testifying in court, but one other thing that they said is our community needs to show up in court every day. No blacks were ever placed on a jury in the state of Alabama until after the second United States Supreme Court ruling, where the state of Alabama initiated the Welch Act, where they had to go back and refill the jury boxes with the names of blacks.
Judge Horton, Judge Edwin Horton, who is a fascinating historical study and a fascinating historical personality. Judge Horton is a circuit judge here in North Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. Judge Horton at the time has a rising political star. He has impeccable legal training. He's very politically popular and viewed as an incredibly able and competent legal mind. Judge Horton will ultimately risk and ultimately lose everything that he has gained politically up until that point, culturally, socially up until that point, and agree to preside over this case as judge. An incredibly unpopular decision, a political decision that would have far-reaching and far-ranging consequences in his personal life. But Judge Horton chooses to pursue justice. And the heavens did, in fact, fall for him in a very personal way. But that is the rising action that leads to the case coming to Decatur. It's determined that the Scottsboro community is highly prejudiced and prejudicial, and so they relocate the case from Scottsboro, Alabama to Decatur, Alabama, and Judge Horton agrees to preside over the retrial.
You have to understand, during the trials, this neighborhood was terrorized nightly by the Klans, shooting people's houses. And one young man, James Royal, was killed. 16-year-old boy was killed. Of course, nobody was charged with it, but he was killed. The Klans, going through the neighborhood, shooting up the neighborhood.
The Klan were at one time coming across the bridge. Judge Horton got wind of it and raised the bridge to keep the Klan from Huntsville and Athens from coming into Decatur. What had happened is that the governor had sent the Hartselle National Guard unit out to protect the blacks as well as the attorneys, the defense attorneys. Now, also, the Scottsboro Boys, when they came to trial here, they were placed in the Morgan County Jail that had been condemned for white people. The white prisoners had been taken to Huntsville. So they put them in this rat, bedbug infested jail. All eyes are on Decatur, Alabama, because by now this trial has become a national and international trial. The mothers, Miss Patterson and the Wright boys, Mother Beatrice Maddox, the sister, they have been going all over the world, to England and those places, to in support of their children, to free the Scottsboro Boys. Ruby Bates, Victoria Price, is when she comes to trial, for 16 minutes, she goes on and on and on, and she is so descriptive with this false accusation that many of the men just bowed their heads, and the women went out of the courtroom. She said that six of the boys were on her and 6 were on Ruby Bates. And she talked about how they hit her in the head and blood trickled. And that's another thing, with Judge Horton having a medical degree, these women were examined a few hours after they were pulled off the train. So Dr. Bridges and Dr. Lynch had already said, we don't find any evidence that they were raped. Now, there was semen there, but no present semen. And there's very few bruises on them. They were not hysterical. They were not breathing hard. None of that. Pulse were not racing. And so Judge Horton actually just, makes an inquiry. He keeps asking all of these medical questions to him. And he testified, we don't see that. And so that took a lot of courage as well.
Ruby Bates was the witness for the prosecution, but in the end, she was the witness for the defense. She recanted her story and said they did not rape us. Victoria Price forced her into this narrative. But you know what? They still found them guilty. That's the sad part about it. Just think of those 9 young boys' lives ruined forever. Who knows what they could have been? In telling the Alabama freedom story, it is important because you have to realize not only did they have struggle in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, we had the struggles here also. So I thought, okay, we got all of this information. What are we going to do with it? We need to build a museum. Old Town in Decatur cannot be left out. And of course, once we get the museum up and going, we will be connected to the Civil Rights Trail. Decatur will become the gateway to the Civil Rights Trail coming from the north. So this story has always been in our mind. So we recognize that we have to do something so it will be here for generation, and generation. All of this information that we have collected, which is thousands of pieces of information, we cannot die and it'd be in one person's house, another person's house, another person's house, because it would all get lost. Then maybe 20 years from now, somebody will say, there's wonderful history in the Old Town community. They have to start all over again. That's why this project has to be developed, and it will be developed.
There were people in this church who understood that their progress in life wasn't just about them, that their economic success wasn't just about them, that their academic pedigree wasn't just about them, but that those were resources that should motivate them to greater service for their community.
In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "Justice, too long delayed, is justice denied." The Scottsboro Boys collectively spent over 100 years in jails and prisons for a crime they did not commit. On July 24, 1934, Roy Wright, Eugene Williams, Olin Montgomery, and Willie Roberson were released and their charges were dropped. Charlie Weems was paroled in September 1943. Andy and Norris Wright were paroled in January 1944. Ozzie Powell was paroled in June 1946. Haywood Patterson died in prison in September 1951. Finally, on April 4, 2013, the 45-year anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Alabama House of Representatives voted 103-0 in favor of a bill to posthumously pardon the Scottsboro Boys. Justice was delayed for 82 years for those 9 young men, but their lives and legacies will live on forever. Let us remember, to remain stayed on freedom.
Stay on freedom. Hallelujah. 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 Walking and talking with my mind.